Welcome to Things You Don't Know. Today, we examine Napoleon Bonaparte's domination of Europe, why he pursued continental supremacy, what he built beyond military victories, and why the system ultimately failed. We will also devote specific attention to his brother, Joseph, whose career as a family monarch in Naples and Spain, and later as an exile in the United States, reveals how Napoleonic power worked in practice.
A very useful way to frame Napoleon is to see him as both an innovator and an inheritor. He inherits the upheaval and bloodshed of the French Revolution, restores order and the traditions of the European coalitions that attempted to contain it and later on contain him. And he innovates in statecraft and war through mass mobilization, administration, law, and the creation and use of client states. These elements create an imperial structure that can, and in the first period, does expand very rapidly. But also, it's a structure that contains intrinsic vulnerabilities.
And we're also going to focus the discussion on three questions here. First, how Napoleon became powerful enough to proclaim an empire. Second, how the imperial project was maintained, especially through relatives such as his brother Joseph. We'll also focus on why the structure failed despite Napoleon's repeated operational successes, and what the end of his life in exile indicates about the limits of his system.
Let's start at the beginning here. How did Napoleon become powerful enough to create an empire? Well, Napoleon rises in a period when France is simultaneously threatened from outside and instability within. The revolutionary decade had produced war, political crisis, and a demand for order. Napoleon converts military reputation into political authority, culminating in the consulate and then a steady consolidation of power using administrative centralization and plebiscitary legitimacy to present himself as a guarantor of stability.
The critical symbolic turning point is in 1804. Napoleon is crowned Emperor of the French at Notre Dame in Paris on December 2nd, 1804, with Pope Pius VII present. The emperor puts the crown on his own head. The event is staged to communicate dynastic legitimacy and permanence. Contemporary and later accounts emphasize the deliberate political messaging of the ceremony as a break from both the Bourbon monarchy and the revolutionary volatility, an empire approved by a plebiscite framed as modern, legalistic, and national.
And from a power analysis perspective, the shift to emperor matters because it changes the mission. A republic at war can argue that it is defending itself, but an empire tends to require projection, prestige, and durable control of strategic zones. The coronation is not nearly ceremonial. It signals Napoleon's intent to build a new European order and to secure succession, which makes dynastic placements such as Joseph in Naples and Spain structural rather than just incidental.
So, Napoleon's motives are best understood as being layered. There is a security logic. France has been repeatedly attacked by coalitions, and Napoleon sought strategic frontiers and buffer states. There is also a governance logic. He believed he could impose rationalized administration and legal uniformity across Europe, creating a continent that was more predictable and, importantly, more controllable from Paris.
There is also a geopolitical logic shaped by Britain. Britain wanted no one hegemonic power in Europe. Unable to reliably defeat Britain at sea, Napoleon attempts to isolate it economically through his continental system, pressuring European states to restrict trade. This demands enforcement across ports, customs routes, and allied governments, which in practice can deepen occupation and intensify resentment. The strategy makes European compliance a central requirement of the French grand strategy, pushing Napoleon into increasingly expansive and expensive commitments.
And this produces a recurrent pattern. The empire expands not only because Napoleon seeks conquest for its own sake, but because its own strategic move creates new enforcement problems that seem to require additional control. The more the system depends on compliance, like economic, administrative, and or military, the more costly it becomes to tolerate autonomy in allied or satellite states. And that logic helps explain why the family empire emerges and why it creates backlash.
So, in military terms, Napoleon's empire reaches a point where France and its allies or client states dominate much of continental Europe. The achievement is not only battlefield victory, but also the repeated reconfiguration of borders and governments. This matters because it is conquest married to institutional redesign, new administrations, new legal codes, and new political hierarchies intended to be durable.
The administrative legacy is substantial. Across territories either influenced or controlled by Napoleon, reforms tend to emphasize centralized governments, standardized civil law, and a professional bureaucracy. Napoleonic legal code becomes a major vehicle for this broader project. Its influence persists even today in Louisiana, even where Napoleon's political control does not. At a minimum, it accelerates legal modernization, emancipation of oppressed minorities, including Jews, and the restructuring of property and civil relations in places that either adopted or adapted.
And it's also important to separate two outcomes that coexist. First, Napoleon's system spreads institutional techniques, centralization, codification, administrative rationality that can outlast him. Second, it generates resistance because those changes often arrive through occupation, indemnities, conscription, and the visible assertion that Europe is being reorganized for French strategic benefit. The empire's modernizing aspects therefore do not prevent and can even intensify nationalistic and local opposition.
Joseph Bonaparte is central to understanding the imperial method. Napoleon places relatives on thrones as a mechanism of control and legitimacy. Joseph becomes king of Naples and then king of Spain. The intention is that Joseph provides stable civil administration while France secures strategic direction. This arrangement demonstrates how Napoleon tried to turn military dominance into a federated dynastic order.
Spain is the decisive test, and the failure is instructive. Joseph's rule, being a Frenchman, faces a legitimacy crisis from the start, and the conflict escalates into a protracted war with guerrilla dimensions. That's where the term is created, in fact, and major external involvement, notably from Britain. Joseph is forced into a role that is neither purely sovereign nor purely administrative. He is expected to govern while the state's coercive capacity is contested and while Napoleon's broader strategy demands both compliance and resources. The result is sustained instability that drains French manpower and damages imperial credibility.
Absolutely, Dr. Deneen. And Joseph's experience here shows that dynastic appointments do not automatically translate into political legitimacy. If the local elites and populations regard the new monarch as imposed, the state then becomes difficult to govern without continuous military pressure. And I have to say, folks, continuous pressure is rather costly. This makes Joseph an empirical case study of why Napoleon's system could expand rapidly, but yet struggle to consolidate in places where national identity, religion, and local institutions were mobilized against French rule.
So let's take a little side trip here and look at Joseph's exile in New Jersey. After Napoleon's final defeat and abdication in 1815, Joseph's position in Europe becomes untenable. He travels to the United States under an assumed name, most famously Comte de Sevilla, and initially lives in New York and Philadelphia while establishing a more permanent residence. The United States offers distance from Allied surveillance and European retaliation, and it provides a setting where a prominent exile can live with relative security.
Joseph's New Jersey residence is the Point Breeze estate near Bordentown. He also spent some time in a place called Long Beach Island, where I often went as a child. Sources describe him assembling a substantial property and using it as a social and cultural center, including with an extensive art collection, and this would have made me very happy, an extremely major library. Accounts note that he lived largely in the United States for a sustained period, which is often summarized as between primarily 1817 and 1832, while remaining connected to European political networks and émergé circles.
The "why New Jersey" question is best answered in practical terms. Joseph sought proximity to major Atlantic cities, Philadelphia and New York, without living permanently in their political spotlight, and Point Breeze offered both seclusion and status. The estate becomes a kind of informal court in exile, a place where European visitors, American elites, and French immigrants could meet. Joseph eventually returns to Europe later in life, but the New Jersey period is not a footnote. It is a meaningful chapter in how Napoleonic dynasts adapted to the post 1815 world.
Yeah, Napoleon's regime faced persistent internal threats as well as external enemies. Assassination plotting is a recurring feature of his political environment, especially during the consulate and early empire, reflecting the intensity of ideological and dynastic opposition. Historians do not agree on a single exact number, but the scale is significant enough to shape security practices and governance.
A frequently cited scholarly estimate comes from the historian Philip Dwyer, who suggests Napoleon faced on the order of what he called between 20 and 30 assassination plots or attempts during his rule. This is best treated as an estimate rather than a precise count because the term plot, attempt, and conspiracy can be defined very differently across sources. Still, well-known cases include the 1800 dagger plot, the Rue Saint-Nicaise bombing attempt in December of 1800, and the 1809 attempt by Prussian intelligence agent Friedrich Steps.
Now, two brief clarifications are useful here. First, the number matters less than the pattern. Napoleon governed as a target, and this influenced policing, censorship, and the cultivation of loyal administrative structures. There's also an anecdote cited in popular histories. After the treaties of Tilsit in 1807, a celebratory rabbit hunt was organized, and the released rabbits reportedly swarmed Napoleon and members of his party rather than fleeing. It is a great reminder that even carefully staging imperial spectacles can become unpredictable and practiced.
Yeah, we actually did a podcast about that, Chandler, and we wanted to include this because I think it's hilarious.
It is.
I think it is too, as you discussed in the previous podcast.
Yeah. Now, Napoleon's downfall, we should look at that. It emerges from compounding pressures, economic strain from the continental system, the draining conflict in Iberia, and the increasing difficulty of sustaining loyalty among allies and client states. Military dominance does not automatically yield political durability when the costs of reinforcement rise faster than the system's capacity to absorb them. Am I not right there, Dr. Deneen?
You're absolutely right. It's the 1812 invasion of Russia that's a pivotal rupture. Whatever Napoleon's operational competence, that campaign exposes the limits of imperial logistics and coercive diplomacy, as well as the terrible effects, as Hitler finds out a century and a half later, of the Russian winter. When a major power refuses to remain inside the Napoleonic system, enforcement becomes essential, and the attempt to compel Russia back into alignment produces catastrophic attrition. The failure of Napoleon's Polish uprising did not help. After 1812, the coalition structure against France becomes more coherent and more confident, accelerating the collapse.
And this is where the logic of earlier success becomes dangerous. The empire had been built on rapid victories and negotiated restructurings, but once defeats and attrition undermined the aura of inevitability, the political geometry changes. Allies hedge, occupied regions resist more openly, and rival powers coordinate. By the time Napoleon returns during the Hundred Days, then the broader European decision is effectively made. The system will not be allowed to reconstitute itself.
Yes. Napoleon's second exile after Waterloo, for example, is designed to be final. He is sent to St. Helena, remote and controllable. The symbolism is unmistakable. The international order that defeated him intends to prevent the reemergence of his regime by removing the figure around whom it could cohere.
Napoleon died on St. Helena Island on May 5th, 1821, at his estate there at Longwood. Contemporary medical accounts and later historical summaries emphasize that an autopsy concluded stomach cancer, with ongoing debate in later centuries about contributing factors and alternative explanations, including poisoning. The most defensible baseline statement remains that the autopsy findings supported stomach cancer as the principal cause.
And and may I just say, Dr. Weaver and Dr. Deneen, I think that out of all the times, the 20 or 30 times that there were assassination attempts on his life. I think it's just so ironic that he finally died, but not from assassination, but from blood poisoning. What about you guys?
Or stomach cancer, as Dr. Deneen said. Yes, I think that is an irony worth mentioning.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of stomach cancer and blood poisoning, right, Dr. Deneen?
There also was some blood poisoning, even if it wasn't the main cause.
Okay. Okay. So it's interesting nonetheless.
Yes, I think so. And so, from an analytical standpoint, the death and exile closes the arc of personal rule. The empire is not simply defeated militarily, but it is dismantled politically and symbolically. Joseph's American exile at Point Breeze and Napoleon's confinement on St. Helena are parallel outcomes of the same post 1815 settlement. One, a relatively free social exile, and the other one, a relatively controlled detention, both aimed at ensuring that the Napoleonic project could not be reassembled around family and charisma.
Today, we emphasized that Napoleon's conquest was inseparable from institutional ambition, and that Joseph's trajectory from king to American exile reveals the practical limitations of dynastic governance imposed by force.
The Napoleonic era ends, but it leaves behind administrative practices, legal influence, and a transformed European political landscape, alongside a cautionary lesson about the fragility of imperial systems that rely on continuous enforcement and personal legitimacy.
Absolutely, Dr. Deneen. And the additional details also matter here. Assassination plots reflect the permanent vulnerability of the regime. And Joseph's New Jersey exile shows how the Bonapartist network adapted when formal power ended, and Napoleon's death in remote custody underscores how thoroughly Europe sought to close the Napoleonic chapter for good.
Well, we could go on with this, but we have to end sometime, and this seems like the right time.
Yes, it does.
And appreciate you all tuning in, and hope you'll come back soon.
Absolutely.
A lot of wonderful things coming up here, folks. So long for now.